Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Have you ever wondered how a nation that had survived centuries of floods, wars and hardship could, in the span of only a few years, lose the basic rhythm of eating enough to live? That quiet question sits at the centre of tonight's story, not as a riddle to solve quickly, but as a slow unfolding of choices, pressures and beliefs that shaped everyday life for hundreds of millions of people. This is not a tale of distant legends or dramatic heroes. It is a modern history, built from farms, meeting halls, paper reports and ordinary kitchens that slowly ran empty. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere in the world right now, feel free to share your location and local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of the Great Chinese Famine begins quietly, long before hunger became visible. In the mid-1950s, the People's Republic of China was still young. The Civil War had ended less than a decade earlier, and the new government under Mao Zedong was focused on rebuilding a country that had been battered by invasion, inflation, and chronic poverty. Food shortages were not new to China. For centuries, Chinese history had been marked by cycles of flood, drought, and famine. What made the late 1950s different was not the presence of hardship, but the belief that hardship could now be engineered away by human will, planning, and speed. By 1957, many leaders in Beijing felt that the early years of socialist reconstruction had gone well. Land reform had redistributed fields from landlords to peasants. Grain output had risen modestly. The Soviet Union, China's powerful ally at the time, offered a model of rapid industrial growth that seemed both impressive and achievable. Within this atmosphere, patience began to look like weakness. Gradual improvement felt insufficient for a nation eager to stand strong after decades of humiliation. The countryside, where most Chinese people lived, became the stage for ambitious change. Villages that had long followed seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest were now expected to produce not just food, but evidence of ideological success. Grain was more than sustenance. It became a symbol of loyalty and progress. Reports of bumper harvests were praised, shared, and often exaggerated, creating a sense that abundance was already at hand. At the centre of this confidence stood the idea that collective effort could overcome natural limits. If labour was organised properly, if enthusiasm replaced caution, then output could rise far beyond traditional expectations. The state encouraged local officials to think big, to promise bold results, and to avoid conservative thinking, a term that increasingly meant any expression of doubt. By 1958, this mindset crystallized into what became known as the Great Leap Forward. It was not introduced as a famine-causing policy, nor even as a risky one. It was presented as a leap into prosperity, one that would allow China to catch up with and even surpass industrialized nations in a remarkably short time. Steel production, irrigation works, and agricultural yields were all expected to soar together. But before hunger arrived, before death entered the picture, there was paperwork, there were meetings, there were slogans painted on walls and banners raised in fields. Local cadres, the officials responsible for implementing policy at the village and county level, faced intense pressure to demonstrate success. In a political culture that rewarded optimism and punished hesitation, honest reporting became difficult. To report a poor harvest was not simply to state a fact. It could be interpreted as a personal failure or even political disloyalty. As a result, grain figures began to drift away from reality. A harvest that was average might be reported as excellent. One that was slightly improved might be recorded as miraculous. These numbers travelled upward through administrative layers, gaining authority as they went. By the time they reached provincial and national planners, they painted a picture of abundance that did not exist on the ground. This illusion had consequences. Believing grain supplies to be plentiful, the state increased procurement quotas, the amount of grain that villages were required to hand over to the government. This grain was meant to feed cities, support industrial workers, and serve as a reserve for the nation. In theory, villages would still retain enough to feed themselves. In practice, the quotas were often calculated from inflated production figures, leaving far less behind than officials realized or were willing to admit. At first, the strain was subtle. Meals became simpler. Portions grew smaller. Families stretched grain by mixing it with wild plants or husks. Communal enthusiasm and social pressure encouraged people to endure quietly, trusting that temporary discomfort would lead to future abundance. Many believed sincerely that sacrifices were necessary and meaningful. The cultural atmosphere of the time reinforced this belief. Newspapers celebrated record harvests and heroic labour. Stories of doubt rarely appeared in print. Travel between regions was limited, making it difficult for people to compare experiences or recognise the scale of emerging problems. Hunger, when it appeared, felt local and personal, not national. Yet beneath the optimism, the granaries told another story. In many rural areas, storage facilities emptied faster than expected. Grain was moved out of villages according to plan, but the plan itself rested on false assumptions. As months passed, the gap between reports and reality widened. Local cadres faced impossible choices: admit shortages and risk punishment, or enforce quotas and hope conditions would improve. By late 1958 and into 1959, signs of crisis were becoming harder to ignore. Some regions experienced poor weather, while others suffered from labour shortages as workers were diverted to industrial projects. These factors alone might have caused hardship, but combined with policy pressure and distorted data, they pushed fragile systems toward collapse. Still, there was no single moment when the famine was declared or even widely acknowledged. Hunger did not arrive with ceremony. It crept in through missed meals, exhaustion, and illness. Villagers continued to work fields that yielded less each season, while official announcements spoke of success. The distance between lived experience and public narrative grew wider, creating a silence that would prove deadly. The crisis in the granary was not simply about empty bins. It was about information, how it moved, how it was shaped, and how fear and ambition altered its path. It was about a political environment where speed mattered more than accuracy, and unity mattered more than correction. Most of all, it was about ordinary people whose lives were bound to decisions made far above them, decisions that would soon reshape the meaning of survival itself. As the Great Leap Forward gathered momentum, the foundation of China's food system was already under strain. What followed was not an accident in the narrow sense, nor an inevitable outcome of nature. It was the result of interacting forces, ideology, administration, and human behaviour that turned confidence into catastrophe, slowly and relentlessly. The Great Leap begins. As the Great Leap Forward moved from slogans into daily life, the weight of its demands settled most heavily on ordinary people. For many rural families, the late 1950s were not experienced as a bold national experiment, but as a steady tightening of expectations layered onto bodies already accustomed to hard work. The promise of abundance remained distant, while the effort required to reach it became immediate, physical, and exhausting. In villages across China, the pace of life accelerated sharply. Long before shortages were officially acknowledged, fatigue became a constant companion. Days began earlier and ended later. Labour schedules were reorganised to fit political targets rather than agricultural rhythms. Farmers who had once measured their effort by seasons now measured it by quotas, meetings and campaigns. Rest was increasingly framed as indulgence. Endurance became a moral standard. The introduction of the Great Leap Forward altered not only what people did, but how they understood their own suffering. Hardship was no longer simply a fact of rural life. It was recast as proof of commitment. To struggle was to contribute, To complain was to fall behind. This shift in meaning made physical pain easier to ignore, at least at first, but also harder to address when it became unbearable. Communal labour intensified these pressures. Villagers were grouped into large work teams, sometimes numbering in the hundreds or thousands, tasked with ambitious projects such as irrigation canals, dams, and land reshaping. The work was often heavy and repetitive, involving digging, hauling earth, and moving stone by hand. Tools were basic. Protective equipment was rare. Injuries were common, but rarely stopped the work. Food intake did not match this increased exertion. Communal dining halls replaced family kitchens in many areas, promising efficiency and equality. In practice, meals were thin and monotonous. Portions were set, not according to individual need, but according to availability and policy. Those engaged in the heaviest labour received little extra nourishment. Over time, people learned to conserve energy, moving more slowly, speaking less, resting whenever possible. Hunger changed how people felt in their own bodies. At first, it was a dull sensation, easily dismissed. Later, it became sharper and more persistent. Workers described dizziness, weakness, and difficulty concentrating, though such experiences were rarely recorded formally. As hunger deepened, physical appearance changed. Faces grew thinner, eyes appeared larger, clothing hung loosely. These changes were visible to everyone, yet rarely discussed openly. Emotionally, the strain was equally severe. Many people believed sincerely in the goals of the Great Leap Forward. They had lived through war and chaos and wanted stability. This belief made early sacrifices feel purposeful. But as months passed without improvement, doubt crept in quietly. People wondered whether they were failing, or whether the promises themselves were unrealistic. These thoughts were often kept private, even within families. Fear shaped behaviour as much as hunger did. Local cadres were under pressure from above, and villagers understood this. Refusing work assignments or failing to meet expectations could lead to punishment, public criticism, or loss of access to food. In some areas, grain distribution was tied to labour participation, making survival contingent on continued work, even as bodies weakened. Children experienced the crisis differently but no less intensely. Schools were disrupted as students were mobilised for labour or kept home to conserve food. Growth slowed. Illness spread more easily among undernourished bodies. Parents faced the quiet terror of watching children lose weight, knowing there was little they could do to help. Traditional strategies such as saving extra food for the young became impossible when nothing extra existed. Elderly villagers suffered as well. Many had lived through previous famines and recognized the signs early. Their experience told them that reserves were insufficient, that weather and policy together were creating danger. Yet age carried little authority in the new political environment. Decisions were driven by ideology and targets, not by memory. Older people, less able to perform heavy labour, often received smaller portions and were among the first to weaken. The brutality of the period did not always come from direct violence. It emerged from exhaustion, deprivation, and the slow erosion of choice. People continued to report to work even when ill. Injuries went untreated. Minor ailments became serious. Hunger made tempers short and judgment poor. Small conflicts over food or labour could escalate, not because people were cruel, but because they were depleted. In many villages, foraging became a quiet necessity. Wild grasses, roots, and leaves were gathered and cooked into thin soups. Some of these plants provided minimal nutrition, others caused digestive problems or poisoning. Knowledge of edible plants varied by region and generation. Desperation pushed people to experiment, often with painful consequences. Social relationships were strained. Communal living reduced privacy. Scarcity sharpened awareness of who received what. Rumours spread easily, especially when official information was scarce. Trust eroded, Not dramatically, but gradually. People watched each other more closely, unsure whether scarcity was shared equally. The emotional toll was deepened by uncertainty. No one knew how long the situation would last. Official messages continued to emphasize success and future abundance, creating a dissonance between public optimism and private suffering. This gap made people question their own perceptions. If the radio said harvests were excellent, why were they hungry? Was the problem local, temporary, personal? As the Great Leap Forward progressed, the gap between effort and reward widened. People worked harder than ever, yet felt weaker each day. The promise that sacrifice would soon yield relief began to feel hollow. Still, most continued to comply. Resistance was rare, not because suffering was light, but because alternatives were few. This period marked a psychological turning point. Hunger was no longer an inconvenience. It became a defining feature of daily life. Sleep was restless. Dreams were filled with food. Waking hours were dominated by the calculation of energy. How much strength remained? How much was needed to get through the day? The Great Leap Forward, as experienced by ordinary people, was not a sudden catastrophe. It was a grinding process. Each day demanded slightly more than the last, while providing slightly less in return. The brutality lay in its persistence. There was no clear enemy to blame, no single moment of collapse. There was only the slow realization that the system meant to deliver abundance was instead consuming those who sustained it. By the end of this phase, hunger had become widespread, though uneven. Some regions suffered more than others. Some households coped better, drawing on hidden reserves or connections. But for many, the physical and emotional reserves were nearly exhausted. The Great Leap Forward had begun as a campaign of optimism. For those living through it, it was becoming a test of endurance that few had chosen, and none could escape. Communes, and the new daily order. As hunger tightened its grip, the structure of daily life itself was reshaped in ways that made suffering both more intense and harder to escape. The creation of the people's communes was meant to be the Great Leap Forward's most visible achievement. On paper, communes promised efficiency, equality, and shared prosperity. In lived reality, they transformed how people ate, worked, rested, and even thought about themselves, often stripping away the small buffers that had once helped families endure hard times. The commune was not simply an administrative unit. It was an attempt to reorganize human life at scale. Villages were merged into vast collectives, sometimes encompassing tens of thousands of people. Private plots were eliminated or sharply reduced. Livestock, tools, and grain stores were pooled. Family kitchens were closed in favour of communal dining halls. The intention was to free people, especially women, from domestic labour, so that all energy could be directed toward production. For many villagers, the transition was abrupt and disorienting. Customs that had governed rural life for generations vanished within weeks. Meals were no longer prepared at home, where portions could be quietly adjusted to suit children, elders, or the sick. Instead, everyone ate the same food, in the same place, according to the same rules. What had once been intimate routines became public acts. At first, some welcomed this change. Early dining halls were stocked with what appeared to be generous supplies, reinforcing the belief that abundance had arrived. People ate freely, sometimes more than usual, encouraged by slogans suggesting that grain was no longer a concern. This brief period of relative plenty would later deepen the sense of shock when food began to run out. As shortages emerged, communal dining became one of the harshest aspects of famine life. Portions shrank steadily. Bowls held little more than watery porridge. Meals that once anchored the day became moments of anxiety. People stood in line, watching the ladle, hoping it might dip a little deeper for them or their children. Hunger became public and inescapable, visible in every face around the table. The loss of private kitchens removed an important coping mechanism. In earlier times, families could stretch food quietly, save scraps, or adjust cooking methods. Under the commune system, food distribution was centralized. Control rested with cadres and kitchen managers, themselves operating under pressure and shortage. This system left little room for flexibility or mercy. Work routines were equally rigid. Labour was assigned collectively, often without regard for individual capacity. Men, women, teenagers, and older people were all expected to contribute. Pregnant women worked until exhaustion forced them to stop. The sick were encouraged to overcome weakness. Rest days became rare. The idea that anyone might need special consideration clashed with the political emphasis on equality and discipline. The physical toll was severe. As calorie intake fell, bodies weakened, muscles wasted. Wounds healed slowly, if at all. People fainted in the fields or collapsed while carrying loads. When this happened, the response was often to urge them back to work as soon as possible. Falling behind meant risking reduced rations, which in turn made recovery impossible. Emotionally, the commune eroded a sense of personal agency. Decisions that once belonged to households were now made collectively, or imposed from above. Parents could no longer decide how to allocate food within the family. Elders lost their traditional authority. Individuals felt increasingly replaceable, valued primarily for labour output rather than experience or care. Fear became woven into daily routine. Cadres were responsible for meeting production targets and enforcing rules. Some tried to shield villagers quietly, bending regulations when possible. Others enforced policies strictly, either out of conviction or fear for their own positions. Punishments ranged from public criticism to loss of food access. Even when violence was rare, the constant possibility of reprisal shaped behaviour. Silence became a survival strategy. People learned not to speak openly about hunger or exhaustion. Complaints could be interpreted as resistance. Resistance, even in mild form, carried consequences. As a result, suffering was endured privately, even when it was shared collectively. This silence deepened isolation, making people feel alone even when surrounded by others. Children grew up quickly in this environment. Hunger sharpened awareness. Many learned to work alongside adults, their small bodies struggling under tools and loads meant for larger frames. Schooling suffered. Lessons were interrupted or abandoned altogether. For children, the commune was not an abstract political idea, but the place where they lined up for food that was never enough. Elderly people often fared worst. Unable to meet labour expectations, they were sometimes viewed as burdens on scarce resources. Communal ideals of equality did not translate into protection for vulnerability. Older villagers, already weakened, slipped quietly into severe malnutrition. Their decline was gradual and often unnoticed until it was irreversible. The brutality of commune life was cumulative rather than explosive. Each rule, each ration cut, each longer workday pushed people closer to the edge. There was no single policy that caused collapse. Instead, it was the interaction of many small constraints, all reinforcing each other, that made daily existence so punishing. Psychologically, the loss of family autonomy was devastating. Families had long been the primary unit of resilience in rural China. Under the commune system, that unit was hollowed out. Parents could not protect children. Children watched parents weaken. Spouses worked apart for long hours, sharing little more than brief moments of rest. Shame accompanied hunger. In a culture that valued endurance and contribution, weakness felt like failure. People blamed themselves for falling ill or lagging behind. This internalization of responsibility masked structural causes and delayed collective recognition of crisis. As months passed, the initial optimism surrounding communes vanished. What remained was a tightly controlled environment where scarcity governed every interaction. The promise of shared prosperity had given way to shared deprivation, though deprivation was never evenly distributed. By the time famine conditions became undeniable, the commune system had already reshaped how people responded to suffering. It discouraged open complaint, limited mobility, and centralized control over food. These features, intended to strengthen production, instead magnified vulnerability. When the system failed, there were few remaining informal networks to fall back on. For many who lived through this period, memories of the famine are inseparable from memories of the commune. Hunger was not experienced alone in a quiet home, but in crowded halls, long lines, and exhausting work teams. The lack of privacy made suffering feel exposed, yet speaking about it felt forbidden. The new daily order of the communes did more than reorganize labour. It redefined dignity, endurance, and survival. It taught people how thin the line could be between participation and punishment, between belonging and abandonment. In doing so, it laid the groundwork for the most devastating phase of the famine still to come: steel fever and lost labour. As the famine deepened, another demand pressed down on already weakened bodies, one that would quietly drain the countryside of strength at the very moment it was most needed. This was the drive for steel production, an obsession that came to be known among villagers as steel fever. It was promoted as proof that China could industrialize at breathtaking speed, but on the ground it felt like a relentless diversion of time, energy, and attention away from food, survival, and rest. The idea itself was simple and forceful. Steel symbolized modern power. Nations with steel built machines, railways, and armies. If China could rapidly increase its steel output, it could shorten the distance between itself and the industrialized world. Targets were announced publicly, revised upward repeatedly, and celebrated with enormous enthusiasm. Every province, county, and commune was expected to contribute. For rural communities, this meant building backyard furnaces. These furnaces were often crude structures made from mud bricks, clay, and scrap metal. They were erected quickly, sometimes in the middle of fields or village squares. Once built, they demanded constant attention. Fires had to be fed day and night. Materials had to be gathered, sorted, and melted. Labour that would normally have gone into planting, weeding, or harvesting was redirected into feeding these fires. The physical cost was immediate. Collecting fuel meant cutting trees, stripping hillsides of brush, and hauling heavy loads over long distances. Tools, pots, door hinges, and even farm implements were melted down to meet quotas. This destruction of useful metal would later compound agricultural problems, but at the time it was seen as patriotic sacrifice. For the people doing the work, the experience was exhausting and often frightening. Backyard furnaces produced intense heat. Smoke burned the eyes and lungs. Burns were common. Protective gear was non-existent. People worked in shifts that blurred into one another, sleeping briefly near the furnaces before returning to stoke the fires. Hunger made this work especially punishing. Weak bodies laboured in extreme conditions with little nourishment. Emotionally, steel production carried a strange mix of pride and despair. Some villagers believed sincerely that they were participating in something historic, that their suffering would be remembered as necessary and meaningful. Others felt confusion and quiet resentment. They could see fields neglected, crops unharvested, and tools destroyed, yet they were told that steel mattered more. As weeks passed, the consequences of this diversion became visible. Fields were left unattended during critical periods. Weeds spread. Harvests were delayed or incomplete. The loss of labour was not evenly distributed. Young and strong workers were often pulled into steel production, leaving behind the elderly, women, and children to manage agricultural tasks beyond their capacity. The steel itself often proved useless. Backyard furnaces rarely reached the temperatures needed to produce quality metal. Much of what emerged was brittle, impure, and unusable. Villagers could see this with their own eyes, yet quotas demanded production regardless of quality. The act of producing steel mattered more than the result. This disconnect between effort and outcome weighed heavily on morale. People worked themselves to exhaustion, sacrificing food and sleep, only to produce material that could not fulfill its intended purpose. The sense of futility grew quietly, often unspoken, adding to the emotional burden of hunger. The brutality of this phase lay in its indifference to human limits. The system did not adjust when bodies weakened. Instead, it demanded more. Work schedules expanded. Night shifts became common. The glow of furnaces lit villages after dark, casting long shadows over faces already drawn thin by hunger. For families, the absence of working members deepened strain. Parents and children were separated for long hours or days. Meals were missed entirely when work ran through dining times. Communication within families became minimal, reduced to brief exchanges before collapsing into sleep. Illness spread quickly under these conditions. Smoke inhalation, malnutrition, and exhaustion weakened immune systems. Minor infections became serious. Yet medical care was scarce, and time off work was discouraged. People pushed through fever and pain, fearing loss of rations or public criticism. The psychological pressure was relentless. Public meetings praised high steel output and criticized lagging units. Individuals who faltered were singled out as lacking revolutionary spirit. Shame became another weight to carry, reinforcing silence and compliance. Children, watching adults labor at furnaces instead of fields, absorbed a distorted lesson about value. Food production, once central to life, seemed secondary to industrial symbolism. This confusion added to their anxiety as hunger worsened. As steel fever spread, its environmental impact compounded agricultural problems. Deforestation reduced soil stability. Erosion increased. Fuel shortages forced people to burn crop residues and household items, further undermining future harvests. These effects were not immediately recognized, but they quietly reduced resilience. By the time doubts about backyard steel reached higher levels of leadership, the damage was already done. Fields had been neglected, tools destroyed, bodies depleted. Even when steel targets were quietly revised downward, the lost labour and energy could not be recovered. For villagers, this period marked a shift from hardship to something harsher. Hunger was no longer paired with the hope that work would soon bring relief. Instead, work itself felt detached from survival. People laboured intensely, yet food grew scarcer. This contradiction eroded trust, not only in policy, but in the idea that effort and reward were connected. The emotional landscape grew darker. Conversations became shorter. Laughter faded. People conserved not only energy but feeling. Grief, fear, and frustration were pushed inward, rarely expressed openly. The brutality of steel fever was not only physical, it was psychological, teaching people that their suffering might be demanded without clear purpose. As the Great Leap Forward continued, steel fever drained the countryside at the worst possible moment. It removed hands from fields, strength from bodies, and tools from daily life. It asked people to give what they no longer had, and punished them when they could not. Numbers that mislead. By the time hunger had become a daily companion and exhaustion an accepted condition of life, another force was tightening its hold on the countryside. Quieter than steel furnaces and less visible than empty bowls, yet just as destructive, this force was numerical. It lived in reports, tables, slogans, and meetings. It was the transformation of harvest figures from measurements into declarations and then into obligations. For ordinary people, this invisible process shaped how much food was taken, how much remained, and how little room there was to survive. In theory, the system of reporting agricultural output was straightforward. Villages measured their harvests. Counties compiled the figures. Provinces summarized them. The central government used these numbers to plan procurement, distribution, and future targets. In practice, the system had become deeply distorted, and the consequences of that distortion were borne by people who never saw the reports that determined their fate. The pressure to report success had been building for years. Under the Great Leap Forward, success was not merely desirable, it was politically necessary. Local cadres were expected to demonstrate that revolutionary enthusiasm could produce extraordinary results. High numbers signalled loyalty, competence, and ideological correctness. Low numbers suggested doubt, hesitation, or failure. In this environment, accuracy became dangerous. A village that reported modest yields risked being labelled backward. A cadre who questioned targets risked being accused of lacking faith in socialism. Even when officials privately knew that figures were inflated, correcting them felt riskier than passing them along. This inflation rarely happened through a single dramatic lie. More often, it emerged through small adjustments. A good field was taken as representative of the whole village. Losses were ignored. Estimates replaced measurements. Optimism filled in gaps where data was uncertain. Once one level of administration reported higher figures, the next level felt pressure to improve upon them. As numbers travelled upward, they hardened into fact. By the time they reached provincial or national planners, they appeared consistent, authoritative, and reassuring. Charts showed rising output. Speeches celebrated unprecedented abundance. These numbers justified decisions that reached deep into village life. The most immediate consequence was procurement. The state claimed a portion of the harvest to feed cities, supply industry, and maintain reserves. Procurement quotas were calculated from reported production. When production figures were exaggerated, quotas were too high. Villages were required to surrender grain that did not exist. For villagers, this process felt arbitrary and brutal. Grain was measured, loaded, and taken away, sometimes under supervision. What remained was often far less than what families needed to survive the year. Complaints were met with reminders of duty and sacrifice. Officials pointed to reports that showed plenty, implying that shortages were the result of mismanagement or hoarding. Hoarding itself became a dangerous accusation. In an atmosphere of scarcity, keeping grain for one's family could be framed as selfishness or resistance. Fear of being accused led many to surrender even hidden reserves. The boundary between survival and punishment blurred. Emotionally, this was one of the most devastating aspects of the famine. Hunger caused pain, but the sense of being disbelieved caused despair. People knew how much they had harvested. They knew how much had been taken. When officials insisted that grain was abundant, villagers began to doubt not only the system but their own voices. Reality itself felt negotiable, decided elsewhere. The brutality of misleading numbers lay in their finality. Once quotas were set, they were difficult to revise. Even as evidence of shortage mounted illness, weight loss, declining labour capacity, the figures on paper remained unchanged. Numbers, once recorded, carried more weight than bodies. Local cadres were trapped as well. Some knew the reports were wrong, some had inflated them themselves under pressure. All were accountable for meeting quotas. Failure could result in demotion, criticism, or worse. To protect themselves, many enforced procurement aggressively, even as they watched villagers weaken. Meetings became rituals of reassurance. Charts were displayed. Targets were praised. Problems were attributed to temporary setbacks or insufficient effort. The language of success continued even as the material basis for that success vanished. This disconnect created a surreal atmosphere where words and experience diverged sharply. For villagers, this meant living in two worlds at once. In the public world, abundance was declared. In the private world, hunger dominated. Speaking openly about this contradiction was dangerous. Silence became safer than truth. The misreporting of numbers also delayed recognition of the famine at higher levels of government. Leaders relied on data to understand conditions across a vast country. When that data was distorted, so was perception. Hunger appeared localized, temporary, or exaggerated. The idea of a nationwide crisis seemed implausible against charts showing record harvests. This delay was deadly. Early intervention might have saved millions of lives. Instead, corrective measures were postponed. Grain continued to flow out of rural areas. Relief was limited or non-existent. The system trusted numbers over lived reality. Psychologically, the experience was crushing. People felt erased. Their suffering did not register where decisions were made. The sense of abandonment deepened, not because help failed to arrive, but because it was never clearly requested in a language the system accepted. Children absorbed this lesson early. They saw adults working harder while eating less. They heard slogans praising abundance while watching relatives grow thin. This dissonance shaped a quiet cynicism, a learned caution about official narratives that would linger long after the famine ended. As hunger worsened, some cadres attempted quiet adjustments. They underreported procurement, hid grain, or redistributed food discreetly. These acts carried risk. Discovery could bring severe punishment. The fact that such measures were necessary underscored the system's rigidity. The numbers also distorted future planning. Inflated harvests led to even higher targets the following year. Expectations rose as reality fell. The gap widened. Each cycle made correction harder, not easier. The brutality here was systemic rather than spectacular. There were no dramatic scenes of violence tied directly to reporting. Instead, there was a slow, grinding process by which false abundance justified real deprivation. People starved not only because food was scarce, but because scarcity was denied. As bodies weakened, labour output declined. This decline, in turn, was interpreted as laziness or ideological weakness, reinforcing the demand for greater effort. The logic became circular and cruel. Hunger reduced productivity. Reduced productivity justified criticism and pressure. Pressure deepened hunger. By the time the scale of the disaster became undeniable, the numbers had already done their work. They had removed flexibility from the system. They had hardened policy. They had silenced early warnings. For those who lived through it, memories of the famine are inseparable from memories of being counted incorrectly, of being told that what they felt was impossible, of watching grain leave while being assured that plenty remained. The Great Chinese Famine was not only a failure of production, it was a failure of measurement and honesty. Numbers, meant to guide planning, became weapons against reality. They stripped suffering of legitimacy and delayed compassion until it was too late. As the crisis deepened, the consequences of these misleading numbers would grow even more severe. Hunger would spread, mortality would rise, and the distance between paper abundance and lived starvation would become one of the defining tragedies of modern history. Grain procurement tightens. As the countryside weakened and the illusion of abundance hardened on paper, the system that removed food from villages grew more rigid and more unforgiving. Grain procurement, once framed as a shared national duty, became the most direct and brutal interface between policy and human survival. For ordinary people, this was the moment when hunger stopped being a background strain and became an unavoidable daily emergency. Procurement was not a single event. It was a process that unfolded in stages, visits, inspections, and repeated collections. Officials arrived with ledgers and quotas already fixed. The numbers did not bend easily. Grain was counted, weighed, and loaded, often under supervision. Once taken, it rarely returned. Villagers watched sacks leave their communities knowing, with growing clarity, that nothing equivalent would replace them. At first, many believed that compliance would bring relief later. They had been told that grain was needed to support cities, industry, and reserves that would protect everyone in the long run. This belief weakened as months passed and hunger worsened. The promised return never came. Instead, procurement visits became more frequent and more aggressive. The physical act of taking grain was emotionally devastating. Grain was not an abstract commodity. It was labour crystallized. Each sack represented weeks of planting, weeding and harvesting, often done by hands already worn thin. Watching it leave felt like watching one's own strength carried away. As shortages intensified, the search for grain grew more invasive. Storage areas were inspected, homes were checked. Hidden caches, once a traditional safeguard against bad harvests, became liabilities. The fear of being accused of hoarding was constant. Hoarding was framed as sabotage, a moral failing rather than a survival strategy. Punishments could be swift and humiliating. For families, this created unbearable tension. Parents debated whether to hide small amounts of grain for children or elders, knowing discovery could endanger everyone. Some chose concealment, risking punishment. Others surrendered everything, hoping endurance alone would suffice. Neither choice offered safety. The brutality of tightened procurement lay in its timing. It did not adjust when hunger appeared. Instead, it intensified precisely when reserves were lowest. Quotas remained fixed even as production fell. In some areas they increased, driven by inflated reports and political pressure. Local cadres were caught in an impossible position. Failure to meet quotas could cost them their positions or worse. Enforcing quotas meant taking food from people who were visibly starving. Some cadres hardened themselves emotionally, treating enforcement as mechanical necessity. Others suffered quietly, enforcing rules by day and wrestling with guilt by night. Public criticism sessions became more common. Villagers accused of withholding grain were shamed before their neighbours. These sessions were meant to extract compliance and reinforce discipline. In reality, they deepened fear and mistrust. Hunger stripped people of patience. Communities fractured under pressure. For those already weakened by malnutrition, procurement visits could be fatal. People fainted during inspections. Elders collapsed while carrying grain to collection points. These incidents were rarely recorded as causes of death. They were absorbed into the background of exhaustion. Children learned quickly that food was dangerous to talk about. Asking for more could attract attention. Crying from hunger was sometimes met with anger, not cruelty, but desperation. Parents, powerless to help, struggled to maintain calm. Emotional bonds were strained by the constant pressure of scarcity. The tightening of procurement also revealed stark inequalities. Urban residents were better protected. Cities received grain to maintain industrial output and political stability. Rural suffering was largely invisible to urban populations, reinforcing a sense among villagers that they had been sacrificed. Travel restrictions compounded this isolation. Movement between regions required permits. Leaving a starving village for a city in search of food was often impossible. Those who attempted it risked detention and forced return. The body itself became trapped, confined within administrative boundaries that hunger did not respect. As winter approached in many regions, conditions worsened sharply. Cold increased caloric needs while reducing available labour. People burned crop residues and furniture for warmth, further undermining future survival. Grain procurement did not pause for weather. The emotional impact of this phase was profound. Hope narrowed. People stopped planning beyond the immediate day. Conversation revolved around food, or avoided it entirely. Dreams became restless. Waking life felt heavy and dim. Illness spread rapidly under these conditions. Edema, caused by severe protein deficiency, appeared in many villages. Legs and faces swelled even as bodies wasted away. This visible sign of starvation frightened people, but also normalized the idea that extreme hunger was common. Despite mounting evidence of catastrophe, the procurement system moved slowly to change. Information about deaths traveled upward unevenly, filtered by fear and disbelief. In some regions, emergency adjustments were made, but they were inconsistent and often too late. The tightening of grain procurement marked the point where famine became entrenched. It was no longer a temporary crisis or localized shortage, it was systemic. The flow of food moved in one direction, away from those who needed it most. For survivors, memories of this period are often vivid and painful. the sound of grain being poured into sacks, the sight of carts leaving, the silence that followed. Hunger was no longer just the absence of food. It was the presence of loss, repeated again and again. This phase stripped away illusions. People understood, with quiet clarity, that the system was not responding to their suffering. Survival became an individual and familial struggle within a collective structure that offered little protection. As procurement tightened, the conditions were set for the famine's deadliest years. The reserves that might have softened the blow were gone. Bodies were weakened. Trust was eroded. What followed would not be a sudden collapse, but a widening of death into everyday life. The granaries were empty where people lived, full where policy demanded, and sealed where correction was slow to arrive. In that gap, millions would suffer, quietly and relentlessly. Weather, pests, and policy collide. By the time hunger had settled into bodies and routines, nature added its own weight, not as a single dramatic blow, but as a series of stresses that exposed how little margin for error remained. Weather had always shaped Chinese agriculture. Droughts and floods were familiar risks, remembered in stories and local records. What made the late 1950s and early 1960s so devastating was not that weather turned hostile, but that policy had already removed the buffers that once absorbed its impact. When environmental strain arrived, there was nothing left to soften it. In some regions, rainfall failed, fields cracked and hardened, seedlings withered before they could establish roots. In others, rain arrived too heavily, washing away topsoil and young plants. Rivers overflowed, damaging crops and infrastructure. None of these events were unprecedented on their own. What was new was the inability of communities to respond flexibly. Granaries were empty. Labour was exhausted. Tools had been melted down or broken. Knowledge that might have guided adaptation was sidelined by campaign logic. People felt the weather not as an abstract force, but as pain layered onto pain. A dry wind across a field was no longer just uncomfortable. It was a reminder that harvests would be smaller still. Rain that might once have been welcomed now brought dread, because flooded fields could not be replanted, and there was no reserve grain to bridge the gap. Each shift in weather translated directly into hunger. The emotional impact of this was heavy. Many villagers believed deeply that human effort could overcome nature. This belief had been encouraged relentlessly. When effort failed to do so, it created confusion and despair. People worked harder in response to poor weather, pushing weakened bodies further, believing that labour alone might still save the crop. When it did not, the sense of personal failure deepened. Pests added another layer of strain. In a balanced agricultural system, birds, insects and predators form a rough equilibrium. Under campaign-driven thinking, this balance was disrupted. Large-scale pest eradication efforts were launched with enthusiasm, based on simplified ideas of enemies and productivity. The most famous of these targeted sparrows, blamed for eating grain. The campaign against sparrows was carried out with intensity. Villagers were mobilized to scare birds from fields and nesting sites, banging pots, waving flags and destroying nests. Sparrows, unable to rest, fell from exhaustion. Their absence was celebrated as victory. At the time, few considered what else sparrows ate. When insects multiplied unchecked, crops suffered further damage. For people already hungry, watching crops damaged by insects felt unbearable. It was not anger so much as helplessness. Fields that had demanded so much labour yielded even less. The effort-to-reward ratio collapsed. People bent over plants that would not feed them, knowing there was no alternative work that might. Policy responses to these environmental stresses were slow and uneven. Official narratives emphasized human agency and downplayed natural limits. Poor yields were often attributed to insufficient effort rather than weather or ecological imbalance. This framing placed responsibility back onto villagers, intensifying pressure rather than easing it. The brutality of this phase lay in its relentlessness. Hunger weakened bodies. Weak bodies produced smaller harvests. Smaller harvests were blamed on insufficient labour or commitment, leading to even greater demands. Weather and pests did not create the famine on their own, but they accelerated its descent into mass suffering by exposing how tightly stretched the system had become. Daily life reflected this collapse. People rose before dawn, already tired. Workdays lengthened. Breaks disappeared. Hands shook with weakness while gripping tools. Concentration faltered. Accidents increased. A slip in a wet field or a misjudged step while carrying loads could result in injury that never healed properly. Illness spread more easily under these conditions. Malnutrition, compromised immune systems, respiratory infections followed cold, damp weather. Diarrheal diseases spread when clean water was scarce. Medical care, always limited in rural areas, was overwhelmed. People treated themselves with home remedies or simply endured. Emotionally, fear shifted from abstract worry to concrete expectation. People anticipated loss. They learned not to hope for good weather or healthy crops, because disappointment cost energy they could not spare. This emotional flattening was a quiet survival strategy. By lowering expectations, people tried to protect themselves from despair. Children felt these changes acutely. Hunger slowed growth. Weather kept them working outdoors in conditions their bodies could not tolerate. They learned early to read signs of rain and heat not with curiosity but with dread. Childhood narrowed to work and waiting. Older people, already fragile, declined rapidly when environmental conditions worsened. Cold nights and damp clothing aggravated joint pain and respiratory illness. With little food to generate warmth, bodies struggled to maintain temperature. Many elders retreated into stillness, conserving energy, fading quietly. The collision of weather, pests, and policy also revealed inequalities between regions. Areas with slightly better soil or more favourable microclimates fared marginally better. Others collapsed quickly. This unevenness complicated recognition of the crisis. Where crops failed catastrophically, famine was undeniable. Where failure was gradual, suffering remained hidden longer. Local officials faced mounting contradictions. They saw weather damage and pest infestations with their own eyes. Yet reporting these realities honestly risked political consequences. Many continue to attribute losses to human factors, reinforcing policies that demanded more labour from weaker bodies. The sense of being trapped deepened. People could not work their way out of hunger. They could not move to seek relief. They could not speak openly. Weather and pests became symbols of fate, not because people were fatalistic, but because all other avenues of response had closed. In this environment, even small environmental setbacks had outsized effects. A late frost could mean the difference between minimal survival and starvation. A localized flood could erase an entire season's hope. Each event tightened the spiral. The psychological toll accumulated quietly. People spoke less. Faces became expressionless. Grief was muted, not because it was absent, but because it was constant. There was no space to process loss before the next blow arrived. This phase of the famine is often misunderstood as natural disaster layered onto policy failure. In reality, the two were inseparable. Weather and pests exposed the fragility created by policy. Policy magnified the damage caused by environment. Together, they closed off escape routes. By the time leadership began to acknowledge environmental factors more openly, the countryside was already exhausted. Adaptation requires energy, resources, and trust. All three were in short supply. The fields reflected this exhaustion, producing less each season, mirroring the bodies that worked them. For survivors, memories of these years often centre on the sky. Too dry, too wet, too cold, too unpredictable. Weather became something to endure rather than manage. It was no longer part of a cycle, but a threat layered onto an already unbearable present. As weather, Pests and policy collided. The famine entered its most destructive phase. Death would soon become more visible. Entire communities would be reshaped. What had begun as strain and shortage was becoming a sustained humanitarian disaster, unfolding slowly, without announcement and without relief. The land, like the people, was asked to give more than it could, and when it failed to do so, the consequences fell hardest on those with nothing left to give. The Sparrow Campaign aftershock. By the time the famine tightened into something unmistakable, many people sensed that the land itself had turned against them. Fields that once carried grain now seemed fragile and exposed. Crops disappeared under waves of insects. The air felt emptier, quieter, stripped of movement that had once gone unnoticed. For villagers already weakened by hunger and labour, this change was not an abstract ecological shift. It was another blow, one that arrived after they had already lost the strength to absorb it. The campaign against sparrows had begun with confidence and clarity. Sparrows were labelled pests, enemies of grain, symbols of waste in a system striving for efficiency. Their destruction was framed as a simple equation: fewer birds meant more food for people. The logic appealed to a mindset shaped by targets and visible results. Sparrows could be counted. Their absence could be celebrated. What could not be easily counted was the balance they helped maintain. When sparrows vanished from fields and villages, insects flourished. Locusts, caterpillars, and other crop-eating insects multiplied rapidly, unchecked by natural predators. For people already living on the edge of starvation, the sight of insects consuming what little remained in the fields was devastating. Crops that had survived drought, flood, and neglect were stripped away in days. The emotional impact was immediate and crushing. Hunger already dominated thought. Now there was the added horror of watching food disappear while being powerless to stop it. People tried to crush insects by hand, shake plants, burn fields, anything to protect what remained. These efforts were exhausting and often futile. Each failure deepened despair. This ecological collapse did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded in waves. One infestation followed another. Fields that looked promising one week were bare the next. Villagers learned not to trust appearances. Green did not mean safe. Growth did not mean harvest. Physically, this period was among the most punishing. People were already malnourished. Their bodies lacked the reserves needed for sustained labour. Yet the response to pest damage demanded more work, not less. Days stretched longer. Nights were interrupted. Sleep was shallow and restless. Hunger gnawed constantly, making even simple tasks feel overwhelming. Emotionally, the sense of betrayal was profound. People had followed instructions. They had participated in campaigns. They had destroyed sparrows as told. Now they paid the price for decisions they had not made. This realization was rarely spoken aloud, but it settled heavily. Trust, already eroded, thinned further. Children witnessed these changes closely. Many had taken part in the Sparrow campaign, running through fields, shouting, waving cloths. At the time, it felt like a game, an act of participation. Now they watched insects devour crops and learned, quietly, that actions praised one season could bring suffering the next. This confusion added to their fear. The brutality of the aftershock lay in its timing. Ecological imbalance struck when people were least able to respond. In earlier times, pest outbreaks could be offset by reserves, replanting, or migration. Now granaries were empty, seeds scarce, movement restricted. The system had no flexibility left. Illness surged during this period. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Insect damage forced people to consume unfamiliar plants, some toxic, leading to poisoning and digestive illness. Clean water was harder to access as infrastructure deteriorated. Diarrhea and infections spread quickly, particularly among children and the elderly. Death became more visible. It did not arrive dramatically. It appeared as people failing to rise in the morning, as elders quietly slipping away, as children growing too weak to cry. These deaths were rarely recorded accurately. They blended into the landscape of hunger, becoming both shocking and, tragically, expected. Communal life magnified this visibility. Bodies were seen daily, decline was public, yet grief remained muted. There was little energy for mourning. Survival demanded focus. Emotional numbness became a defense. Local officials faced growing contradictions. They could see insect damage clearly. They could see people starving. Yet the ideological framework offered few tools for response beyond intensified effort. Admitting ecological error risked political consequences. Many continued to emphasize labour and discipline, even as returns diminished further. The aftershock of the Sparrow campaign also revealed how fragile the idea of control had been. The Great Leap Forward was built on the belief that nature could be commanded through will and organisation. The explosion of pests exposed the limits of that belief. Nature did not respond to slogans or targets. It responded to balance, which had been disrupted. For villagers, this realization was not empowering. It was terrifying. If nature could no longer be trusted, and policy could not be questioned, where could safety be found? The answer, increasingly, was nowhere. The psychological atmosphere grew heavy and still. People spoke less. Laughter vanished almost entirely. Faces were expressionless, not from indifference, but from exhaustion. Grief accumulated without release. Families faced impossible choices. Seeds meant for planting were eaten. Doing so offered immediate survival but guaranteed future failure. Many chose survival. The future felt abstract compared to the pain of the present. These choices haunted survivors long after the famine ended. As crops failed repeatedly, labour incentives collapsed. People worked because they had to, not because they believed effort would yield food. This shift mattered. Motivation eroded. Work slowed. Fields deteriorated further. The cycle tightened. Children absorbed the lesson that hunger was unpredictable and uncontrollable. They learned to conserve energy, to move slowly, to speak softly, to play, disappeared. Childhood contracted into endurance. Older villagers, who remembered earlier famines, recognized the signs of ecological collapse. They had seen pests devastate crops before, but never under conditions this rigid. Their knowledge, once valued, was now sidelined. Watching history repeat itself without the tools to respond was emotionally devastating. The aftershock was not confined to fields. It entered homes, bodies, and thoughts. Dreams were filled with images of insects, empty fields, missed harvests. Waking life offered little relief. As the ecological consequences of the Sparrow campaign became undeniable, some adjustments were quietly made. Policies shifted, campaigns faded. But damage already done could not be undone quickly. Ecological systems take time to recover. People did not have time. This phase deepened the famine's cruelty. It removed hope that hard work alone could restore stability. It showed that even obedience and enthusiasm could lead to disaster. For many, this realization marked a turning point from endurance to resignation. The famine was no longer something that might pass. It had become an environment shaping every thought and movement. Hunger was not just in the stomach. It was in the air, the fields, the silence between people. As the Sparrow campaign's aftershock spread, the countryside entered its darkest period. Death would become more frequent. Entire villages would thin. What had begun as policy error and administrative distortion now merged fully with ecological collapse, leaving people exposed on all sides. The land, stripped of balance, offered little. The system, rigid and slow, offered less. And in that narrowing space, millions endured a suffering that was both preventable and relentless, quiet and overwhelming, carried forward day by day without relief. Winter hunger spreads. When winter arrived, it did not bring a clear turning point. It brought confirmation. Cold settled over villages that had already been hollowed out by hunger, and with it came a clarity that could no longer be avoided. The shortage was no longer seasonal or temporary. It was structural, and it was everywhere. Winter did not cause the famine, but it removed the last disguises that had allowed people to believe survival might still come easily. Cold intensified hunger in simple, unforgiving ways. Bodies need more calories to stay warm. Fires need fuel. Movement slows when muscles are weak. In the countryside, winter had always been difficult, but it was normally buffered by stored grain, preserved foods, and family-level coping strategies. During the famine years, those buffers were gone. Granaries were empty. Private storage had been stripped away. Communal kitchens served thinner meals than ever. For many people, winter hunger was the moment when the body began to fail in visible ways. Weight loss accelerated. Skin grew dry and cracked. Hair thinned. Edema appeared more frequently, swelling legs and faces even as muscles wasted beneath. People struggled to walk long distances. Simple tasks, such as carrying water or firewood, became exhausting. Daily routines narrowed sharply. Life contracted around survival. People rose later, conserving energy. Work continued, but at a slower pace, punctuated by frequent pauses. Tools felt heavier. Breath came shallow. Speech became brief and economical, not out of secrecy, but because talking required energy that was in short supply. The communal dining halls, already bleak, became places of quiet dread. Bowls held watery gruel made from coarse grains or substitutes. Sometimes the grain ran out entirely before the end of the day. People lined up anyway, hoping. The sound of ladles scraping the bottom of pots became familiar and painful. Hunger was no longer a sensation. It was a constant state. Emotionally, winter hunger carried a heavy stillness. Panic, which sometimes flared earlier in the famine, gave way to resignation. People learned what to expect and adjusted their emotions accordingly. Hope was rationed like food. Anticipation focused on the next meal, the next hour, the next day. Long-term thinking felt impossible. Children suffered deeply during this period. Cold and hunger combined to stunt growth and weaken immunity. Many became lethargic, losing interest in play or conversation. Schooling had largely collapsed, replaced by labour or inactivity. Parents watched children fade quietly, unable to protect them. The guilt and fear this produced was often overwhelming, but there was no outlet for it. Elderly villagers faced winter with particular vulnerability. Many could not generate enough body heat. Without adequate food or warm clothing, they declined rapidly. Some spent long hours lying still to conserve energy. Their withdrawal was not dramatic. It was a slow dimming, often unnoticed until it was too late. Illness spread quickly in the cold. Respiratory infections were common. Minor coughs turned serious. Without medicine or adequate nutrition, recovery was slow or non-existent. People worked while sick, because stopping meant losing access to food. This accelerated decline. Winter also revealed the limits of communal ideals. Equality in hunger did not mean equality in suffering. Those with slightly better health or connections fared marginally better. Others fell behind. The gap widened quietly, not through competition, but through attrition. People did not rise above the crisis. They slipped beneath it. For many families, coping strategies became increasingly desperate. Wild plants had already been exhausted. Tree bark, roots and husks were ground into paste. Some consumed substances that provided bulk but little nourishment, filling the stomach without sustaining the body. Digestive illness followed. Weakness deepened. The emotional toll of these choices lingered long after. Eating things known to be harmful or insufficient was not ignorance, it was necessity. Survivors would later remember the taste, the texture, the knowledge that it would not help, and the lack of alternatives. Winter hunger also changed social behaviour. Generosity became difficult when everyone lacked. Sharing continued in small ways, but resources were too scarce to sustain broader support networks. People avoided visits because they could not offer food. Social isolation increased, deepening psychological strain. Death became more visible during winter. Bodies succumbed quietly in homes, in fields, in communal spaces. Funerals were minimal or non-existent. There was little energy for ritual. Loss blended into routine. The boundary between life and death felt thin and unpredictable. These deaths were rarely recorded accurately. Causes were listed vaguely or not at all. Malnutrition weakened people, but death often arrived through infection, exposure, or exhaustion. This made the famine harder to measure and easier to deny, even as its impact spread. Local officials faced mounting evidence of catastrophe. Villages thinned, work teams shrank, productivity collapsed. Some officials reported these conditions honestly. Others softened language or delayed reports. Fear still shaped communication. The system responded unevenly. For villagers, trust in official messaging had largely evaporated. Promises of improvement rang hollow. Radio broadcasts and newspapers felt distant and irrelevant. Reality was measured in bodies, not slogans. Psychologically, winter hunger stripped life of colour. Days blurred together. Memory shortened. People focused on immediate sensation. Cold, pain, fatigue. Emotional expression flattened. This was not apathy. It was conservation. Children who survived this period often carried long-term effects. Growth delays, chronic illness, and psychological scars followed them into adulthood. Memories of winter hunger shaped their relationship with food and security for the rest of their lives. Winter also hardened survival instincts. People learned to move slowly, to sit close to warmth, to sleep as much as possible. These behaviours, adaptive in the moment, reinforced the sense that life had narrowed to endurance alone. As winter deepened, some regions received limited relief. Small adjustments to procurement were made. Grain shipments arrived sporadically. These efforts saved lives, but they were inconsistent and insufficient. For many, help arrived too late or not at all. The spread of winter hunger marked the famine's transition into its deadliest phase. Earlier hardship had weakened bodies. Winter finished the work. Mortality rose sharply, though unevenly, leaving behind a landscape of absence. For survivors, memories of winter are often the clearest. The cold air, the empty bowls, the silence. Hunger in winter was not dramatic. It was heavy, slow, and exhausting. It pressed down until there was nothing left to give. As the cold months passed, the famine no longer needed explanation. It was evident in every village, every household, every body. What remained was the question of how long it would last, and how many would still be alive when it ended. Hidden famine in plain sight. By the time winter loosened its hold and the ground softened again, the famine had already taken on a paradoxical shape. It was everywhere, and yet it remained officially elusive. Villages were thinning, bodies weakening, and death becoming familiar. But at higher levels of the system, the crisis was still fragmented into reports of difficulty rather than recognised as a nationwide catastrophe. This gap between lived reality and official understanding was not simply a failure of information. It was a product of fear, distance, and a system that struggled to hear what it did not want to know. For people in the countryside, the famine was no longer hidden at all. It was visible in faces, in work teams that grew smaller each week, in homes that fell quiet. Children stopped running. Elders stopped leaving their beds. Fields were worked by fewer hands, and even those hands trembled. Yet these signs did not travel upward with the urgency they deserved. Information moved slowly and selectively. Reports passed through layers of administration, each layer shaping the message. Local officials, already under pressure, often softened language. Deaths were described as illness. Hunger was framed as temporary shortage. Numbers were delayed or revised. The truth did not disappear entirely, but it was diluted. Fear shaped this process. Admitting widespread starvation implied failure, not just of policy but of ideology. It raised uncomfortable questions about leadership decisions and campaign logic. For many officials, silence felt safer than honesty. Some convinced themselves that conditions would soon improve, that reporting disaster prematurely would cause panic or punishment. Distance mattered as well. Many senior leaders lived far from the hardest-hit rural areas. When they toured the countryside, visits were planned carefully. Villages were selected. Conditions were staged. Food was borrowed. The reality of famine was briefly concealed behind effort and preparation. These performances were exhausting for villagers, but refusal was not an option. For those suffering, this invisibility was deeply painful. Hunger was not just physical, it was also the experience of being unseen. People knew they were starving. They could see neighbours dying. Yet the system that governed their lives continued to speak of progress and success. This contradiction eroded any remaining trust. Emotionally, this phase of the famine was marked by isolation. People felt abandoned, not necessarily because they believed leaders were cruel, but because they believed leaders did not know. The idea that suffering was happening unseen added a layer of despair. Hunger might be endured. Being ignored was harder. Rumours filled the information vacuum. People whispered about other regions, about cities, about whether help was coming. Some believed relief was imminent. Others believed the famine was punishment or fate. Without reliable information, fear spread unevenly, feeding anxiety and resignation in turn. The brutality of this hidden famine lay in its quietness. There were no public acknowledgements, no emergency declarations, no mobilization for relief at the scale required. Instead, people died within an administrative fog. Their deaths did not trigger alarms. They blended into the background noise of reports that emphasized resilience and effort. Children grew up in this silence. They learned not to ask why food was gone. They learned that suffering could exist without recognition. This lesson shaped how they understood authority and truth for the rest of their lives. Local officials who attempted to report honestly faced difficult choices. Some sent desperate messages upward, only to see them ignored or softened. Others were reprimanded for pessimism. A few persisted, risking their careers. Their efforts mattered, but they were scattered and often overwhelmed by the system's inertia. As the famine worsened, its hidden nature also delayed external awareness. China was relatively closed to the outside world. Foreign journalists had limited access. Information did not circulate freely. What little news emerged was often incomplete or delayed. The famine unfolded largely unseen beyond China's borders. For villagers, this invisibility meant there was no outside witness, no external pressure that might force change. Survival felt entirely internal, dependent on one's own body and immediate community. When those failed, nothing else remained. Psychologically, people adapted by narrowing their expectations further. Hope became dangerous. Anticipation of relief led to disappointment, which consumed precious emotional energy. Many learned to expect nothing. This emotional withdrawal was not apathy, it was protection. Death became normalized in this context. Not accepted, but anticipated. When someone failed to rise in the morning, there was grief, but also recognition. The body had reached its limit. There was no outrage left to spend. The famine's hidden nature also distorted memory. Survivors would later struggle to explain how something so vast could have gone unrecognized for so long. The answer lay not in a single act of denial, but in a system that rewarded optimism, punished doubt, and filtered truth until it lost urgency. This phase marked a turning point. Hunger had moved beyond crisis into catastrophe, yet acknowledgement lagged behind. The distance between those suffering and those deciding had never been greater. In that distance, millions lived and died quietly. By the time broader recognition began to emerge, the famine had already carved deep scars into the countryside. Entire communities were altered. Demographic gaps appeared. The silence that had hidden suffering also preserved it, unaddressed, until the cost became impossible to ignore. The hidden famine was not invisible because it lacked signs. It was invisible because the system could not bear to see them, and in that refusal, suffering multiplied. Cadres, coercion, and survival. As the famine deepened and silence hardened around it, the daily relationship between ordinary people and local authority became one of the most painful and complex aspects of survival. Cadres, the village and county officials charged with enforcing policy, were neither distant abstractions nor uniform villains. They were neighbours, relatives, former classmates, people who shared the same shortages and breathed the same cold air. Yet they also stood at the boundary between policy and hunger, and that boundary became a place of coercion, fear, and moral strain. For villagers, cadres were the face of the state. They organised labour, distributed food, enforced procurement, and reported conditions upward. When grain was taken, it was taken under their supervision. When rations were cut, it was their decision that delivered the blow, even if the order came from far above. This proximity made suffering immediate and personal. Cadres themselves lived under relentless pressure. Their performance was measured by targets they did not set and numbers they could not revise. Failure to meet quotas risked criticism, demotion, or punishment. In an atmosphere where political loyalty mattered as much as results, doubt was dangerous. To hesitate was to invite suspicion. This pressure reshaped behaviour. Some cadres enforced rules with rigid severity, believing that strictness was the only way to survive politically. Others attempted to soften policies quietly, bending rules where they could, hiding grain, adjusting rations, or delaying reports. These acts of mercy carried risk. Discovery could end a career or worse. The brutality of this period lay not only in what cadres did, but in what they were forced to become. Authority-hardened relationships that had once been informal and reciprocal. Neighbours became monitors. Kinship gave way to compliance. Trust eroded on both sides. For villagers, encounters with cadres became moments of anxiety. A visit might mean inspection, accusation, or punishment. Even when nothing happened, the possibility shaped behaviour. People hid food, concealed illness, and avoided attention. Fear became routine. Public criticism sessions intensified these dynamics. Individuals accused of withholding grain or underperforming were shamed before the community. These sessions were designed to enforce discipline and extract compliance. In reality, they humiliated people already weakened by hunger. Shame layered onto starvation deepened psychological injury. The physical brutality of coercion varied by region. In some areas, enforcement remained largely bureaucratic. In others, it involved physical force, confinement, or deprivation. The common thread was the use of hunger itself as leverage. Access to food became conditional on obedience. This conditionality cut deeply into family life. Parents feared that illness or weakness might be interpreted as laziness. Children were pushed to work beyond their capacity. The sick hid symptoms. The elderly tried to appear useful longer than their bodies allowed. Emotionally, this created constant tension. People were torn between resentment and understanding. They knew cadres were under pressure. They also knew cadres controlled access to survival. This ambiguity made anger difficult to express and reconciliation difficult to imagine. Cadres, too, suffered. Many watched neighbours starve while enforcing quotas they knew were impossible. Some developed emotional numbness as a defence. Others carried guilt that would follow them for decades. A few broke under the strain, collapsing physically or psychologically. The famine distorted moral boundaries. Actions that would once have been unthinkable became necessary. Taking grain from starving households, denying food to the sick, punishing weakness. These were not signs of inherent cruelty, but of a system that demanded obedience over care. Survival strategies became entangled with authority. Some families cultivated relationships with cadres, offering labour or loyalty in hopes of protection. Others withdrew, minimizing contact. Inequality widened, not through wealth, but through access. Children learned these dynamics early. They observed who spoke and who stayed silent. They learned that rules could be rigid or flexible depending on circumstance and relationship. This education in power left lasting impressions. The coercive environment also suppressed collective action. Hunger might have united people under different conditions. Here, fear fragmented them. Coordination required trust. Trust was scarce. Each household focused inward, calculating risk. Despite this, moments of humanity persisted. Some cadres quietly shared food. Some villagers protected officials from higher scrutiny. These acts did not reverse the famine, but they mattered deeply to those involved. They remind us that even under extreme pressure, moral choice did not disappear entirely. As deaths increased, the strain intensified. Work teams shrank. Quotas remained. Cadres faced the impossible task of enforcing production among people who could barely stand. The gap between expectation and capacity widened until it could no longer be ignored. Psychologically, this phase was devastating. People felt trapped between hunger and authority, unable to escape either. The sense of being controlled extended into the body itself. Eating, resting, and moving were all regulated, directly or indirectly, by policy. The brutality of cadres' role was not uniform, but it was structural. It arose from a system that placed individuals in positions where harm became routine. Blame, when applied simplistically, misses this complexity. Responsibility was distributed unevenly but relentlessly. For survivors, memories of cadres are often conflicted. Some recall cruelty, others recall kindness under constraint. Many recall both in the same person. These memories resist simple categorization, reflecting the moral ambiguity of survival under coercion. As the famine wore on, the relationship between authority and survival reached a breaking point. Compliance no longer ensured food. Enforcement no longer ensured order. The system strained under its own contradictions. This phase marked a deepening of the famine's human cost. Hunger alone damages the body. Hunger combined with coercion damages trust, memory, and moral certainty. These wounds would outlast the famine itself. In villages across China, people learned a painful lesson. Survival was no longer just about endurance. It was about navigating power while starving, a task that demanded constant calculation and left few unscathed. Migration, control, and desperation. As the famine spread and settled into permanence, the idea of movement began to take on a different meaning. For centuries, when food failed in one place, people moved. This was not rebellion or desperation in the moral sense. It was survival practice learned over generations. Villagers walked to relatives, to markets, to towns, where labour might be exchanged for grain. Movement had always been one of the few tools available to the rural poor when the land could no longer sustain them. During the Great Chinese Famine, that tool was steadily removed. At first, the restriction was subtle. Travel required paperwork. Movement between counties was monitored. Rationing systems in cities were tied to registration. These measures existed before the famine, but hunger transformed their meaning. What had once been administrative inconvenience became a matter of life and death. A starving body without the correct registration could not legally eat. For people in the countryside, this knowledge spread slowly, through rumour and observation rather than announcement. Someone left and did not return. Someone reached a city and was sent back. Someone collapsed on the road. Each story tightened the boundaries of what felt possible. The famine did not empty villages. It trapped them, Physically, the countryside was full of people who no longer had the strength to sustain themselves. Fields lay thinly worked not because there were no hands, but because those hands shook. The effort required to leave a village walking for days, carrying even a small bundle, was beyond many bodies already weakened by months of hunger. Yet the desire to leave persisted. It grew quietly, often unspoken. People did not announce their plans. They thought about roads, about train tracks, about distant towns where factories still ran and food still moved. They imagined that somewhere, just beyond reach, survival might still be possible. The state viewed this impulse as a threat. Large-scale movement would expose the depth of rural suffering and strain urban food supplies. Local authorities were instructed to maintain stability, which in practice meant preventing people from leaving. Patrols were organised, checkpoints monitored roads. Those without permission were turned back or detained. For villagers, this created a new form of despair. Hunger was one thing. Hunger with no exit was another. People knew that grain existed elsewhere. They had seen it transported past their villages. Trains moved, trucks passed. Food was not gone. It was simply unreachable. This awareness cut deeply. Starvation in isolation can be endured with the belief that scarcity is universal. Starvation in proximity to abundance is harder to bear. It produces not only pain, but bitterness and confusion. Why was food allowed to pass by? Why was survival conditional on paperwork? Families faced agonizing decisions. If someone were to attempt escape, who should it be? The strongest, who might survive the journey? Or the weakest, whose chances at home were already slim? Parents debated sending children away, hoping that small bodies might evoke mercy or find informal shelter. Many such children never returned. Their fate was often unknown, leaving families suspended between hope and grief. Those who attempted to leave often did so at night. They carried little. Hunger had already taught them to travel light. Many walked until their legs failed. Some collapsed along roadsides. Others were discovered and sent back, weaker than before. Return journeys were cruel. Shame accompanied them, not because they had failed morally, but because they had failed physically. The enforcement of immobility reshaped daily life. Work teams became not just sites of labour, but of surveillance. Attendance was monitored. Absence raised suspicion. Hunger itself became a tool of control. Rations were tied to participation. To stop working was to stop eating. To leave was to risk losing access to even the smallest portion. This system produced a specific kind of suffering, effort without agency. People worked because they were required to, not because work promised survival. Fields yielded little, bodies weakened further. Yet the demand for labour remained. The connection between effort and outcome dissolved. Emotionally, this eroded dignity. People were not only hungry, they were constrained. They could not decide where to go, how to seek help, or how to change their circumstances. Survival strategies narrowed until only endurance remained. Urban areas occupied a strange psychological space. They were imagined as places of food and order, yet they were also closed worlds. Villagers spoke of cities with a mix of longing and resentment. Grain flowed toward them. Factories operated. Lights stayed on. Yet the gates were closed to those who needed them most. This divide deepened feelings of abandonment. Rural people understood, often with painful clarity, that they were bearing the heaviest cost of national policy. The famine was not shared evenly. It was concentrated where voices were weakest. Within villages, desperation altered social norms. Theft increased, not as organised crime, but as isolated acts of survival. A handful of grain, a stolen root. These acts carried immense risk. Punishment could mean loss of rations or public humiliation, yet hunger pushed people past fear. Trust eroded further. People watched one another closely. Suspicion grew. Communal bonds strained under scarcity. Generosity did not disappear. but it shrank to the scale of what could be afforded. A sip of water, a moment of rest, silence instead of accusation. Children were shaped profoundly by this environment. Hunger slowed their growth. Control restricted their movement. They learned early that asking for food was dangerous and that leaving was impossible. Play vanished. Childhood became waiting, conserving energy, watching adults weaken. Elderly villagers suffered quietly. Many had lived through earlier famines and understood the value of movement. They remembered walking to other regions, finding work, surviving. Now they watched younger generations trapped. This reversal was emotionally devastating. Knowledge that once saved lives was now useless. Local officials enforced restrictions with varying degrees of severity. Some followed orders rigidly. Others tried to look away, allowing small movements to pass unnoticed. These quiet acts of leniency saved lives in some cases and destroyed careers in others. The system left little room for moral clarity. Physically, confinement accelerated decline. People who might have survived by relocating instead wasted away where they stood. Muscles atrophied. Infections spread. Small injuries became fatal. Death arrived not in waves but in steady accumulation. Psychologically, the sense of being trapped was often described by survivors as worse than hunger itself. Hunger hurt the body. Entrapment crushed the mind. The future disappeared. Life became an endless present of pain and fatigue. As desperation deepened, some people simply stopped trying to leave, or even to work. They lay down more often. They spoke less. This was not surrender in a moral sense. It was the body reaching its limit. Biology overtook intention. The famine at this stage was no longer just about food. It was about mobility, choice, and the denial of both. People were starving within reach of food they could not access, inside a system designed to hold them in place. This containment magnified mortality. It ensured that once hunger began, escape was nearly impossible. Villages became closed environments where decline unfolded unchecked. For survivors, memories of this period often center on roads not taken and trains not boarded. The sound of engines passing without stopping, the sight of food moving away, the knowledge that survival existed elsewhere but could not be reached. Migration, once a lifeline, became forbidden. Control, once associated with order, became confinement. Desperation, with nowhere to go, settled fully into the body. And so the famine tightened further, not through sudden violence, but through stillness. People did not flee. They remained. And in remaining, many did not survive. Families under impossible choices. By the time the famine reached its most destructive depth, survival was no longer negotiated at the level of villages or policies alone. It unfolded inside households, inside the narrow space of family life, where hunger forced choices that no one was prepared to make. These were not dramatic decisions announced aloud. They were quiet calculations repeated daily, shaped by weakness, fear, and the shrinking horizon of possibility. Families had long been the primary unit of resilience in rural China. When harvests failed in the past, households adjusted internally. Food was stretched. Labor was reorganized. Elders guided decisions based on experience. During the Great Chinese Famine, these mechanisms were steadily dismantled. Communal systems removed control over food. Migration controls removed escape. What remained was the family, intact in form but stripped of tools. Meals, once the center of family life, became sources of anxiety. Eating was no longer private or flexible. Portions were fixed, often inadequate, and distributed publicly. Parents could not quietly give more to children or elders without risking accusation. Hunger entered the family not as a shared ritual, but as an unspoken tension. Within this tension, choices emerged. Who should eat first? Who should work? And who should rest? Who might still recover? And who was already fading? These questions were rarely spoken aloud, but they shaped behaviour. Parents sometimes skipped meals without explanation. Children were encouraged to eat slowly, to savour what little there was. Elders often insisted they were not hungry, even when their bodies betrayed them. These acts were not heroic gestures in the romantic sense. They were survival instincts shaped by love and guilt. Parents believed that children represented the future, even when the future felt abstract. Elders believed their time had already passed. These beliefs guided sacrifice, even when sacrifice offered no guarantee of survival. The physical toll of these decisions was severe. Parents weakened faster, elders declined rapidly. Children, though prioritized when possible, still suffered deeply. Malnutrition affected growth, cognition, and immunity. Illness spread easily within households where bodies were already compromised. Emotionally, family life became heavy with unspoken grief. Parents watched children lose energy and curiosity. Children watched parents grow thin and silent. Elders watched the erosion of traditions they had once relied upon. There was little space to express fear or sorrow. Speaking required energy, and words offered no solutions. Illness intensified these pressures. When one family member fell sick, care demanded resources that were no longer available. Rest meant reduced labour participation and often reduced rations. Medicine was scarce or non-existent. Families relied on home remedies and hope. Many illnesses lingered, draining strength from caregivers as well as patients. Children bore a particular burden during this period. Hunger altered behaviour. Some became withdrawn, conserving energy. Others grew irritable or anxious. Nighttime was especially difficult. Hunger disrupted sleep. Parents lay awake listening to children breathe, counting breaths, fearing they might stop. Schooling had largely disappeared, replaced by labour or inactivity. Education felt irrelevant when survival was uncertain. Children learned instead from observation. They learned how adults made decisions under pressure. They learned silence, patience, and caution. These lessons would shape them long after the famine ended. Elders faced a different kind of suffering. Many carried memories of earlier famines and knew what was happening. They recognized the signs of irreversible decline. This knowledge brought clarity but also despair. They could see outcomes approaching and felt powerless to alter them. In many households, elders withdrew gradually. They ate less, they spoke less, they spent more time lying down. This withdrawal was sometimes misinterpreted as acceptance. In reality, it was often exhaustion combined with the belief that resources should be saved for others. The brutality of family-level famine lay in its intimacy. Suffering was not anonymous. It was witnessed closely, daily, by those who cared most. There was no distance from pain. Every decline was personal. Death, when it arrived, rarely came with ceremony. Funerals were minimal or postponed. There was little food for gatherings. Grief was private and compressed. Families mourned quietly, often while continuing to work and queue for food. Loss became part of routine. Children who lost parents faced immediate danger. Orphans relied on extended family or communal systems already under strain. Some were absorbed quietly into other households. Others faded from records entirely. Their stories were rarely told. Parents who lost children carried a different weight. The failure to protect offspring violated deep cultural expectations. Survivors often spoke later of lifelong guilt, even when they knew rationally that circumstances were beyond their control. As famine persisted, family structures themselves began to change. Some households merged, pooling resources. Others fractured under strain. Domestic conflict increased, not from cruelty, but from desperation. Hunger shortened tempers and eroded patience. Marriage patterns shifted. Weddings were delayed or cancelled. New households were not formed because they required food and stability. Young adults remained with parents longer, adding pressure to already strained resources. Gender roles also shifted. Women often bore the burden of managing scarcity. They queued for food, prepared thin meals, cared for the sick, and continued labour. Their exhaustion was compounded by responsibility. Many women weakened rapidly, their contributions invisible but essential. Men, expected to perform heavy labour, faced their own pressures. Failure to work meant loss of rations. Illness or weakness carried stigma. Men pushed their bodies beyond limits, collapsing in fields or workshops. Families watched this decline with fear and helplessness. The famine also altered emotional expression within families. Affection became subdued. Touch required energy. Conversation narrowed to practical matters. Love did not disappear, but it was expressed through restraint rather than warmth. As months turned into years, families adapted to a new baseline of suffering. This adaptation was not resilience in the celebratory sense. It was recalibration downward. Expectations shrank. Survival became the only goal. Children who survived internalized these patterns. They learned to eat quickly, to hoard silently, to fear waste. These behaviours persisted long after food returned. The famine imprinted itself on habits and attitudes. The family, once a refuge, became another site of struggle. Yet it was also where humanity persisted most clearly. In small acts of sacrifice, in shared silence, in the decision to endure another day, families held together what remained of social life. These impossible choices did not appear in official reports. They were not counted in statistics, yet they shaped the famine's human cost as profoundly as policy or weather. They determined who lived and who did not, often by narrow margins. As the famine wore on, the accumulation of family-level suffering reached a breaking point. Entire lineages were altered. Generations were thinned. The impact extended far beyond the years of hunger, shaping demographics, memory, and identity. For survivors, memories of the famine are often framed not by ideology or policy, but by family. A mother's smaller bowl, a father's absence, a sibling who did not survive winter. These memories carry the weight of choices made under impossible conditions. The Great Chinese Famine was experienced most intimately, not in meeting halls or fields, but at the family table, where there was less and less to place upon it. And in that narrowing space, love and loss became inseparable. Peng Dehuai and Lushan. By the summer of 1959, the famine had already hollowed out large parts of the countryside, even though it remained officially fragmented and minimized. Hunger was no longer confined to isolated villages or unlucky regions. It had become a systemic condition, woven into daily life through procurement, labour demands, and silence. It was against this backdrop that a political moment unfolded which, in hindsight, marked one of the most consequential missed opportunities of the famine years. The Lushan Conference was convened in July 1959 as a meeting of senior Communist Party leaders. Its purpose was, in theory, to review the progress of the Great Leap Forward and to adjust policy where necessary. By this point, internal unease had been growing. Reports of difficulty had accumulated. Productivity was faltering. Cadres quietly acknowledged that targets had become unrealistic. The conference was meant to take stock. For people in the countryside, Lushan was distant and abstract. They did not know its name. They did not know its agenda. What they knew was hunger. They knew shrinking work teams, swelling limbs, empty kitchens, and the steady disappearance of neighbours. Yet decisions made at Lushan would shape whether that suffering might be acknowledged or prolonged. Peng Dehuai, a senior military leader and long-time revolutionary, arrived at the conference carrying concerns that had been forming for months. Unlike many others, Peng had travelled widely. He had seen the countryside with his own eyes. He had observed neglected fields, exhausted peasants, and unrealistic reporting. What disturbed him most was not merely hardship, but the gap between reality and official narrative. Peng was not an opponent of socialism or the revolution. He was a committed party member who believed deeply in collective ideals. His concern lay in what he saw as deviation from practical reality. He worried that exaggerated reporting, coercive policies, and blind enthusiasm were harming the very people the revolution claimed to serve. At Lushan, Peng chose to express these concerns. He did so cautiously, framing his critique as constructive and loyal. He pointed to inflated grain figures, excessive labour demands, and the suffering of peasants. He urged recalibration, honesty, and restraint. His intention was to correct course, not to challenge authority. The response was swift and devastating. Mao Zedong interpreted Peng's criticism not as policy concern but as political opposition. In the tense atmosphere of the conference, where unity was prized and doubt was suspect, Peng's words were recast as an attack on the Great Leap Forward itself. What might have been a moment of correction became a moment of confrontation. Peng was accused of representing a rightist line, of lacking faith in mass mobilization, and of undermining revolutionary momentum. The focus of the conference shifted rapidly away from examining famine conditions and toward reaffirming ideological commitment. Instead of opening space for honest reporting, the outcome closed it further. For cadres and officials across China, the message from Lushan was unmistakable. If a figure as prominent as Peng Dehuai could be punished for raising concerns, then speaking honestly was dangerous. Silence, optimism, and compliance were safer. The cost of error had been clarified. Peng was removed from his positions and subjected to political disgrace. His fall reverberated far beyond the conference halls. It reshaped behaviour throughout the administrative system. Reports grew more cautious, not in accuracy but in tone. Problems were framed as temporary. Success continued to be emphasised. For the countryside, the consequences were severe. Lushan might have been the moment when famine was openly acknowledged and policy adjusted decisively. Instead, it became the moment when denial hardened. Hunger, already widespread, was allowed to deepen unchecked. Emotionally, the impact of this decision filtered downward in subtle ways. Cadres who had considered reporting deaths or shortages reconsidered. Villagers who hoped that suffering might soon be recognised lost that hope. The gap between lived reality and official acknowledgement widened. The brutality of this phase lay not in new policies, but in the reinforcement of existing ones. Procurement quotas remained high. Labour demands persisted. Migration controls stayed firm. The system, rather than bending, stiffened. For people already weakened by hunger, this rigidity was deadly. Bodies do not respond to ideology. They respond to calories, rest, and care. None of these increased after Lushan. In many regions, conditions worsened. The Lushan conference did not cause the famine, but it ensured its continuation. It transformed a crisis into a prolonged catastrophe by discouraging corrective feedback. It taught officials that loyalty mattered more than accuracy, and that survival of the system took precedence over survival of individuals. Peng Dehuai's experience became a cautionary tale. His willingness to speak was remembered not for its substance, but for its consequences. The lesson absorbed by the bureaucracy was clear. Do not question success, even when it is visibly false. For villagers, unaware of these internal dynamics, the effects were felt indirectly. Relief did not arrive. Policies did not ease. Death continued. The sense that suffering was unrecognised deepened into resignation. Psychologically, this marked a turning point. Earlier, some had believed that hardship was temporary, that leaders simply did not yet know. After 1959, that belief faded. People understood, often instinctively, that acknowledgement was unlikely. Survival became a private matter. The famine's silence was thus reinforced at its highest levels. Decisions that might have saved lives were deferred. Adjustments that might have eased suffering were delayed. The political cost of honesty proved higher than the human cost of hunger. As 1960 approached, mortality rates rose sharply in many regions. Entire villages thinned. The consequences of Lushan were not abstract. They were measured in lives lost in the months and years that followed. Peng Dehuai himself survived the famine years, but his career did not recover. His fall remained a symbol of what could not be said. In later decades, reassessment would come, but too late for those who had already died. The tragedy of Lushan lies in its restraint. There was no dramatic purge on the conference floor, no immediate cascade of arrests. There was simply a choice to listen or not to listen. The choice made favoured certainty over truth. For historians, Lushan stands as a moment when the famine might have turned. For those who lived through it, it stands unseen, its consequences felt but its name unknown. Hunger does not need to understand politics to be shaped by it. The famine continued, not because solutions were impossible, but because they were postponed. The land would not recover quickly. Bodies would not recover at all. The silence that followed Lushan carried forward into the most lethal period of the famine. In this way, the conference became part of the famine structure. It was a reinforcement of denial, a sealing of channels, and a confirmation that suffering, however widespread, would not easily alter direction from above. As the countryside endured another year of hunger, the opportunity for early correction had passed. What remained was damage control delayed, until devastation had already reshaped the nation. Liu Shaoqi, Deng, and course correction. By the time the political atmosphere began to shift again, the countryside had already been reshaped by loss. Hunger was no longer episodic. It was embedded in daily life, etched into bodies and routines. Villages had thinned. Fields were underworked. Entire age groups were visibly reduced. The famine had reached a scale that could no longer be dismissed as local difficulty, even within a system resistant to admitting error. It was in this context that a slow and cautious reassessment began to emerge within the leadership. This reassessment did not arrive as a public declaration or dramatic reversal. It unfolded quietly, through internal discussions, incremental policy changes, and a careful recalibration of responsibility. The figures most associated with this shift were Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, both senior leaders who, in different ways, began to prioritize stabilization over ideological momentum. For those suffering in the countryside, these names were largely unknown. What mattered was not who spoke in Beijing, but whether food arrived, whether work demands eased, whether the relentless pressure of survival might finally lift. Course correction, when it came, was uneven and delayed, but it marked the beginning of the famine's slow retreat. Liu Shaoqi had long been involved in party organization and governance. By the early 1960s, he had become increasingly concerned with the practical consequences of policy. Unlike the rhetoric of the Great Leap Forward, Liu's focus leaned toward order, discipline, and measurable recovery. He did not frame his concerns as ideological opposition. Instead, he emphasized the need to restore basic economic functions. Deng Xiaoping, similarly, had built a reputation as a pragmatic administrator. His experiences during earlier campaigns had reinforced a belief that policy had to account for material reality. Together, Liu and Deng represented a strand of leadership willing to acknowledge, at least internally, that the Great Leap Forward had produced outcomes far removed from its intentions. The first signs of course correction appeared in policy adjustments that, on the surface, seemed minor. Procurement quotas were reduced in some regions. Communal dining halls were allowed to close or operate more flexibly. Private plots, previously condemned, were quietly reintroduced. These changes were not announced as admissions of failure. They were framed as tactical refinements. For villagers, the effects were tangible but inconsistent. In some areas, rations improved slightly. In others, relief lagged. The famine had not affected all regions equally, and neither did recovery. Where adjustments were implemented more fully, survival rates improved. Where they were delayed or resisted, suffering continued. The reintroduction of private plots marked a significant shift in daily life. Families were allowed to cultivate small areas for their own use. This did not end hunger, but it restored a measure of control. Being able to decide what to plant and how to use the harvest mattered psychologically as much as nutritionally. It reconnected effort and reward, even on a small scale. Labour demands were also adjusted. The most extreme mobilizations were curtailed. Backyard steel furnaces were dismantled or abandoned. Work schedules became more manageable. For bodies weakened by prolonged hunger, these changes came late, but they reduced the pace of decline. Emotionally, these shifts produced cautious relief rather than celebration. People had learned not to trust improvement too quickly. Hunger had taught them that conditions could worsen suddenly. Any easing was met with guarded hope, often unspoken. Politically, course correction was delicate. The leadership sought to stabilize without openly condemning earlier policies. Responsibility was diffused. Errors were attributed to excesses or misimplementation rather than fundamental flaws. This framing allowed change without confrontation, but it also limited the speed and scope of reform. Within the bureaucracy, signals from above mattered. After Lushan, officials had learned that speaking openly was dangerous. Now, subtle encouragement to prioritize recovery altered behavior. Reports became more cautious in tone, though not always fully honest. Procurement enforcement softened in some areas. The shift was uneven but real. For families in the countryside, recovery was slow and incomplete. Years of malnutrition had lasting effects. Fields required time to regenerate. Seeds were scarce. Tools had been destroyed. Even with policy changes, rebuilding capacity was difficult. Children who had survived the worst years carried physical and psychological scars. Growth delays were common. Education had been disrupted. Many entered adulthood early, shaped by responsibility and loss. Recovery for them meant not return, but adaptation. Elderly survivors faced a different reality. Many had lost peers, spouses, and social networks. Their communities were altered. Even as food availability improved, loneliness and grief lingered. Mortality rates began to decline as policies shifted. Death did not stop immediately. The weakest had already succumbed, but the pace slowed. Villages stabilized. Life, in a fragile form, resumed. From the perspective of leadership, the course correction was framed as success. Grain production gradually recovered. Order was restored. The immediate crisis eased. From the perspective of survivors, the famine did not end cleanly. It faded unevenly, leaving behind absence and memory. The role of Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping in this period would later be reassessed, politicized, and contested. At the time, their influence was felt not through speeches, but through small changes that allowed survival to resume. The tragedy of the famine's later phase lies in timing. Many of the measures that began to save lives could have been implemented earlier. Their delay magnified loss, yet their eventual adoption prevented further catastrophe. For people in the countryside, the distinction mattered less than the outcome. Food became slightly more reliable. Work became less punishing. Families could begin to plan beyond the next meal. These shifts, modest as they were, marked the end of constant emergency. Recovery did not mean justice or closure. There were no public reckonings. Losses were not formally acknowledged. The famine receded into silence even as its effects persisted. Survivors learned that endurance did not guarantee recognition. As China moved slowly away from the Great Leap Forward, the famine entered a new phase. Not active collapse, but fragile reconstruction. The land, like the people, required time to heal. Course correction, when it finally came, was incomplete and constrained. It saved lives, but it could not restore those already lost. It stabilized the present, while leaving the past unresolved. In this way, the famine ended not with resolution but with quiet retreat. Hunger loosened its grip, but memory did not. The changes led by Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping marked the beginning of survival's return, even as they underscored how costly delay had been. The countryside endured. Life continued, but it did so carrying the weight of years when correction came too late, and when survival depended less on policy than on the sheer endurance of bodies pushed beyond reasonable limits. Relief, recovery, and reckoning. When the famine finally began to loosen its grip, it did not do so with clarity or relief that felt complete. Recovery arrived unevenly, quietly, and often too late to matter for those who had already been lost. For survivors, the return of food did not erase hunger, it altered it. Hunger shifted from an immediate physical crisis into a lingering condition of weakness, memory, and caution that shaped daily life long after grain supplies improved. Relief first appeared not as abundance, but as marginal improvement. Bowls held slightly more, meals became more regular. The fear that food might vanish entirely eased, but it did not disappear. People had learned how quickly conditions could reverse. They approached recovery slowly, uncertain whether it would last. Physically, bodies responded unevenly. Some regained strength gradually, others never fully recovered. Years of malnutrition had damaged organs, weakened immune systems, and stunted growth. Edema subsided, but muscles remained thin. Fatigue lingered. Many people found that even when food returned, their bodies could no longer use it efficiently. Work routines adjusted cautiously. Labour demands eased. Fields were tended with greater care and less urgency. The dismantling of the most extreme campaigns allowed agriculture to reclaim time and attention. This shift mattered. Food production stabilized not because of renewed enthusiasm, but because pressure finally aligned more closely with capacity. Emotionally, relief carried a strange weight. People did not celebrate openly. They had lost too much. The return of food arrived alongside the absence of those who should have been there to eat it. Empty spaces at tables reminded families of loss more sharply than hunger had, because survival had returned, but loved ones had not. Communal dining halls faded or transformed. Families regained some control over meals. Cooking returned to homes, restoring privacy and flexibility. This change mattered deeply. Being able to decide how to prepare food, when to eat, and whom to feed restored a sense of dignity that hunger had eroded. Yet recovery was not simply about food. It was about trust. Years of misreporting, coercion, and silence had damaged confidence in authority and in collective systems. People complied outwardly, but inwardly they remained cautious. Optimism felt risky. Children emerged from the famine altered. Many were smaller than expected for their age. Education resumed unevenly. Schools reopened, but attendance varied. Hunger had taught children to focus on survival rather than learning. Rebuilding curiosity took time. Psychologically, children carried deep impressions. Food scarcity shaped behavior long after conditions improved. Hoarding, rapid eating, fear of waste. These habits persisted. Recovery did not erase them. It normalized them. Elderly survivors faced a quieter reckoning. Many had lost spouses, siblings, and lifelong companions. Communities felt hollow. Even as food returned, loneliness lingered. The social fabric had thinned. The land itself reflected this slow recovery. Fields damaged by neglect, erosion, and ecological imbalance required seasons to heal. Soil fertility had declined. Tools had been destroyed. Seeds were scarce. Agricultural knowledge, disrupted by years of campaigns, had to be reasserted patiently. Policy adjustments continued, cautious and incremental. Procurement remained reduced. Incentives were rebalanced. Private plots expanded quietly. These measures allowed recovery to take root without dramatic acknowledgement of earlier failure. At higher levels, the reckoning remained incomplete. There was no public accounting of deaths. Numbers were debated internally but rarely released. Responsibility was diffuse. Errors were framed as excesses rather than systemic failure. For survivors, this silence mattered. Recovery without acknowledgement left grief unresolved. People carried loss privately, unsure whether it could ever be spoken openly. Memory retreated into family stories rather than public history. Death had reshaped demographics profoundly. Entire age cohorts were reduced. Villages carried gaps that would affect marriage patterns, labour availability, and social life for decades. These absences were not abstract. They were visible. As food availability improved, migration restrictions eased slightly. People moved cautiously. Some sought relatives, others sought work. Movement returned as an option, though its memory as a forbidden act lingered. The famine's end did not feel like an ending. It felt like the lifting of pressure without relief of weight. People resumed living while carrying what had happened inside their bodies and minds. Recovery also brought a re-evaluation of values. People prioritized food security above ideology. Storage, caution, and redundancy became important. Risk aversion shaped behavior. For many, the famine changed their relationship to authority permanently. Trust became conditional. Compliance remained, but belief thinned. This quiet shift would influence later political movements and responses. The reckoning was not only political, it was personal. Survivors asked themselves why they lived when others did not. These questions had no satisfying answers. They remained part of the famine's legacy. As years passed, silence settled over the experience. Speaking openly was discouraged. Memory survived in fragments, tastes, smells, routines, habits. The famine lived on in behaviour more than words. Relief had arrived. Recovery had begun. But reckoning, full and honest, would wait far longer, counting the costs. When the famine loosened enough to allow reflection, one question hovered quietly over the countryside and the institutions that governed it. How many had been lost? This question, simple in form, proved extraordinarily difficult to answer. The Great Chinese Famine did not leave behind a clear ledger. Deaths were uneven, records incomplete, causes blurred, and silence layered over memory. Counting the costs became as complex and contested as the famine itself. For villagers, the cost was not numerical. It was personal and immediate. It was the absence of familiar faces, the empty places in work teams, the quiet houses that no longer opened in the morning. People counted losses by memory rather than statistics. A neighbour who never returned to the fields, a child whose growth stopped, and then whose breathing stopped, an elder who lay down one winter evening and did not rise again. These losses accumulated quietly. There were no mass announcements, no official tallies posted publicly. Death occurred in homes, in fields, in communal spaces, often without ceremony. In many cases, bodies were buried quickly, sometimes without markers. Families did what they could with what little strength they had left. The administrative system struggled to record these deaths accurately. Causes were rarely listed as starvation. Malnutrition weakened bodies, but death often came through infection, exposure, or exhaustion. Official categories reflected this ambiguity. A death might be attributed to illness, old age, or accident, even when hunger had made survival impossible. This misclassification was not always deliberate. It reflected the difficulty of disentangling cause in a context where hunger permeated everything. When a malnourished body succumbed to pneumonia, was hunger the cause or merely a condition? For families, the distinction mattered little. For records, it mattered greatly. Underreporting was common. Local officials, still wary of blame, often minimised death figures. Entire villages might report fewer deaths than actually occurred. Records were delayed, revised, or never submitted. In some cases, deaths went unrecorded entirely. especially among children and the elderly. This absence of data shaped how the famine would later be understood. Without clear numbers, debate flourished. Estimates varied widely. Scholars, demographers, and officials would later argue over figures ranging from tens of millions to lower counts. Each estimate carried political and moral weight. For survivors, these debates felt distant. Numbers could not capture what was lost. A statistic could not convey the feeling of watching a household fade, of realizing that a familiar voice would never be heard again. Counting costs in numbers felt inadequate. Yet numbers mattered. They shaped accountability, memory, and acknowledgement. Without them, the famine risked being absorbed into abstraction, its scale diminished by uncertainty. Demographic evidence provided indirect insight. Population growth slowed sharply, birth rates fell, census gaps appeared. These patterns suggested immense loss, even when individual deaths were not recorded. Entire age cohorts were reduced, leaving long-term imprints on communities. The famine's impact extended beyond mortality. Survivors carried lasting physical damage, chronic illness, stunted growth, and reduced life expectancy followed many into adulthood. These effects did not appear in death counts, but they shaped lives profoundly. Psychological costs were even harder to measure. Trauma lingered in habits, fears, and silences. People who survived famine often developed lasting anxiety around food. Hoarding, rapid eating, and fear of waste became ingrained. These behaviors passed to children, shaping family culture. Social trust suffered as well. Years of coercion, surveillance, and scarcity eroded confidence in institutions and neighbours. Even after recovery, relationships bore strain. Communities rebuilt, but scars remained. The famine also altered China's development path. Resources were diverted to recovery. Policy priorities shifted. Later reforms were shaped in part by lessons drawn, explicitly or implicitly, from the famine's failures. These changes influenced economic and political trajectories for decades. Internationally, the famine remained largely unknown at the time. China's isolation limited external awareness. When information emerged later, it arrived filtered through politics and partial data. Global recognition lagged far behind lived experience. Within China, public discussion was constrained. Memory retreated into private spaces. Families told stories quietly. Official narratives emphasized recovery and resilience rather than loss. The famine became something known but not openly named. This silence complicated reckoning. Without open acknowledgement, responsibility remained diffuse. Errors were framed as collective mistakes rather than individual decisions. Accountability was limited. For survivors, this lack of closure compounded grief. Counting the costs also raised questions of comparison. How did this famine relate to earlier ones? How did it compare to wartime losses? Such comparisons, while analytically useful, risked flattening experience. Each famine has its own texture, shaped by policy, culture, and circumstance. The Great Chinese Famine was distinct in its modernity. It occurred under a centralized state with extensive administrative reach. This reach both enabled rapid mobilization and magnified error. The cost of mistakes scaled with the system itself. For demographers, the challenge lay in reconstructing truth from incomplete records. Birth and death rates, migration patterns, and age distributions offered clues. These analyses suggested massive loss, even if precise numbers remained contested. For families, the challenge lay in living with absence. Counting was not an academic exercise. It was a daily reminder of who was missing. The famine lived on in the spaces between people. As years passed, the cost of the famine became layered. Immediate loss gave way to long-term consequences. Reduced population growth altered labour markets. Family structures changed. Communities aged differently. These effects rippled forward. Memory itself became a cost. Survivors carried experiences that could not be easily shared. Silence protected them from risk but also isolated them. The famine existed as a shared but unspoken past. In later decades, partial reassessments emerged. Scholars revisited data. Officials acknowledged 3 years of difficulty. These phrases hinted at loss without fully confronting it. The language softened the reality. Counting the costs, then, was not simply about numbers. It was about recognition, about whether suffering would be seen, named, and understood. For many survivors, this recognition remained incomplete. The famine's toll cannot be reduced to a single figure. It must be understood as a convergence of death, damage, and distortion that reshaped a society. Its costs were carried in bodies, families, and memory. As the immediate crisis faded, the question of cost lingered quietly. It waited for a future in which it might be asked more openly and answered more honestly. Until then, the true scale of loss lived on in the knowledge of those who endured it. Memory, silence, and long shadow. When the famine finally receded into the past, it did not leave clean edges behind. It did not become a finished chapter that people could close and set aside. Instead, it settled into memory unevenly, shaping behavior, speech, and silence in ways that would last for decades. The Great Chinese Famine ended as an event, but it continued as a presence, quiet, persistent, and deeply embedded in how people understood food, authority, and survival. For survivors, memory was not something stored neatly in words. It lived in habits. People saved scraps instinctively. They avoided wasting food even when plenty returned. Meals were eaten quickly, sometimes anxiously, long after hunger had passed. Children who had never known famine learned these behaviours from parents who could not unlearn them. The past taught lessons that the body remembered even when the mind tried to move on. Silence became the dominant language of remembrance. The famine was known, but not discussed openly. In families, stories were shared selectively, often late at night, often in fragments. A name mentioned, a winter recalled, a sibling who did not survive those years. Details were sparse, emotion was restrained. Silence was not emptiness, it was caution. This silence was shaped by many forces. Politically, open discussion was discouraged. The famine was framed officially as a period of difficulty rather than catastrophe. Responsibility was diffuse. Mistakes were acknowledged abstractly, without specificity. This allowed society to move forward without confrontation, but it left wounds unexamined. Emotionally, silence was protective. Speaking about the famine required revisiting loss. For many, survival had depended on focusing narrowly on the present. Dwelling on the past felt dangerous, destabilizing. Silence allowed life to continue. Generational differences shaped memory. Those who lived through the famine carried it internally. They did not need to speak to remember. Younger generations encountered the famine indirectly, through habits, gaps in family trees, and muted references. The absence of open discussion made the famine feel both distant and unresolved. In villages, the famine's shadow lingered visibly. Some houses remained empty, some family lines ended. Marriage patterns reflected demographic gaps. Certain age groups were smaller. These absences were not explained aloud. They were simply known. The long shadow also extended into attitudes toward authority. Many survivors learned that official narratives could diverge sharply from lived reality. Trust became conditional. Compliance continued, but belief was more cautious. This quiet skepticism shaped later responses to policy and campaigns. Food security became a central concern. Even as China modernized and prosperity grew in later decades, the fear of scarcity persisted. Stockpiling, saving, and planning for uncertainty were common among those shaped by famine. These behaviors were not signs of pessimism. They were lessons learned under extreme conditions. The famine also shaped how suffering was understood. People learned that pain could exist without recognition. That endurance did not guarantee acknowledgement. This knowledge influenced how individuals related to institutions and to one another. Historically, the famine occupied an uneasy place. It was one of the largest human catastrophes of the 20th century, yet it remained less visible than wars or revolutions. Its victims did not fall in battle. They faded in kitchens, fields, and beds. Their deaths were quiet. This quietness made remembrance difficult. There were no monuments, no annual commemorations. Memory survived informally, in gestures, in caution, in the way older people watched younger ones eat. In later years, scholars and officials revisited the famine. Archives opened partially. Studies were published. Numbers were debated. These efforts mattered. They brought some clarity. But they did not fully bridge the gap between lived experience and public narrative. For survivors, the famine was not primarily a historical problem to be solved. It was a life event that shaped who lived, who died, and how those who lived continued. Its meaning was personal before it was analytical. The famine's long shadow also influenced cultural expressions indirectly. Literature, film, and art approached themes of scarcity, endurance, and silence. Even when the famine itself was not named, its imprint could be felt. As decades passed, the urgency of memory softened, but it did not disappear. Older survivors aged. Their memories risked fading with them, yet the famine remained embedded in behaviour, passed on through example rather than explanation. This transmission was subtle. A parent urging a child to finish every grain of rice. A grandparent storing food just in case. These acts carried history without words. The silence surrounding the famine also shaped how it was understood internationally. Without open acknowledgement, the famine remained less visible in global narratives. Its lessons were learned unevenly, often indirectly. Yet the famine's significance endures. It stands as a reminder of how policy, ideology, and administrative systems can interact with devastating consequences. It shows how hunger can be produced not only by nature, but by decisions, incentives, and silence. For those who lived through it, the famine was not an abstract lesson. It was lived reality. Its long shadow stretched across their entire lives, shaping choices large and small. As time moves forward, the challenge of memory remains. How to acknowledge without reopening wounds. How to remember without simplifying. How to speak about suffering that was endured quietly, without spectacle. The Great Chinese Famine ended without ceremony. It was not declared over, it simply loosened its grip. People resumed living, carrying what they had experienced inside them. The shadow it cast is still visible, not always in words, but in caution, in habits, in silence. It reminds us that history does not end when events do. It continues in the lives shaped by those events, long after the immediate danger has passed. And so, the story of the famine concludes not with resolution, but with continuation. Memory remains, silence remains, the shadow remains.